Hi, I'm George Unser, a member of the Humanists and Freethinkers of Fairfield County, Connecticut. Recently, the Humanists and Freethinkers, along with the Connecticut Coalition of Reason, hosted two programs where the topic was evolution. The presenter for one program was Matthew Sasaki, an evolutionary biologist. The other program presenter was James Prosak, an artist. This video combines excerpts from each of their presentations, allowing us to compare their thinking. You're going to be surprised at the result. We will start with a quick view of one of the main slides from each of their presentations. We challenge you to decide which one is art and which one is science.
The central installation in this exhibition at Yale was a color spectrum that I put together with 222 birds from the 150,000 birds in the Peabody collection. It was juxtaposed with a South American feather tapestry made of macaw feathers that's over 1,000 years old on the left. The fun thing sort of about this is some of these specimens are of birds that are extinct. They're very valuable scientifically. But the reason I put them in a rainbow or color spectrum was that I was sort of making this comparison between the color spectrum and the evolutionary continuum. Just as it's very difficult to sometimes draw lines in an interconnected nature on the evolutionary timeline and name the species, the lines that we draw in a color spectrum are arbitrarily drawn. There's no official place in nature where red ends and orange begins. We draw that line and we define it based on whatever terms we want to define it.
This is a relatively new representation of the tree of life, all living things. What I want to point out is this group, Opisthecons. This grouping contains all animal life and all fungi. All animals, all fungus are in Opisthecons. That's this one little branch right there. Everything else in this tree does not require sexual reproduction.
I see the world in what I feel is a Darwinian way. Nature to me is an interconnected, constantly changing continuum. But in order to communicate that continuum, we have to draw lines between things and label the pieces. We have then units of knowledge like species. But as it turns out, those lines that we draw are not always clear where they should be drawn, and they can actually come to cause a lot of problems. But I think that once we create a map to communicate the world through language, we lose sight of the interconnectivity of things sometimes, because in the real world, everything is influencing everything else in an ecosystem or on the entire planet. We come to live in the map instead of the actual territories. I, as an artist and an observer of the world, which scientists are too, of course, I think that artists and scientists have a lot in common. We're both hopefully close observers of the world. I think artists try to document things in the realm of personal experience, things that science can't quantify or solve. As we know, scientists and artists, before science was even a named formal discipline, traveled on expeditions together, made observations, made drawings. Darwin made drawings, Linnaeus made drawings. The two, to me, are not really that different. In any case, I began drawing. Drawing was just something I always did. This is an early Prosak drawing of a warbler. Drawing's the way that I come to know the world. It's sort of a wordless way of embedding the world in my body, making it mine, remaking what's there, almost as a kind of creator or co-creator. When I was 9 years old, I fell in love with fish and fishing, in particular fly fishing for trout. When I was a kid, I would go with my dad to the local library all the time. He always said that if you wanted to learn something, you go to the library. You'll always find a book about some subject. But I couldn't find a book on what I wanted to find one day, which was a book on the trout of North America. We had all kinds of field guides of birds of North America, butterflies in North America, but nothing existed on the trout of North America. So I thought at 10 years old, I'll try to put together a book on the trout of North America. So I started writing letters to departments of wildlife around the country and actually developed correspondences with different biologists who were studying particular kinds of trout over time, over years, and learned that there were sometimes people who studied a particular local species or subspecies of trout their entire lives. So I started slowly putting together a list of all the different trout of North America for a book that I wanted to create one day. But I realized I came across this sort of problem relatively quickly that I hadn't anticipated, because no two of these biologists could agree on what a list of species of the trout of North America would look like. And part of the reason for that is that they couldn't really agree on what the definition of a species was exactly. And that's because when you try to take a nature that's fluid and interconnected and constantly changing, it's not always clear where the lines are. Trout are particularly tricky, a trout, char, and salmon group of fishes to classify because of the way they evolved over successive glaciations. The northern hemisphere would freeze, then it would thaw, then it would freeze, then it would thaw. And every time that happened, the trout had to retreat to the oceans or find or survive in little refuges where the ice didn't form. And then when the ice melted, they would recolonize the rivers and lakes. But sometimes an older population, a relict species, would survive in a pond somewhere, and when the next generation came in, they would hybridize. So it's just really messy. The bottom line was I had a lot of trouble trying to put together a list of all the species. Some people said like the trout from the Snake River drainage in Idaho and Wyoming and Montana was a subspecies. Some said it was a full species. What I learned was that I lost faith in the reliability of names or discrete units to describe a nature that is in constant flux. And it kind of matched up with what I was learning from my father about evolution and how things change over time. In the book that I ended up doing on the trout of North America, I had to sort of make certain decisions about what fish to put in, but I had to describe in each description of each fish that people constantly argue about whether this fish is a separate, discrete unit that's worth being named or not. These exercises are not just sort of intellectual and inconsequential, because certain laws like the Endangered Species Act favor individual animals that have more of a wall around them in our minds. So the golden trout, for instance, which just lives in the high Sierras in California, is really very closely related to the rainbow trout, but they've classified as a separate species so that the public and the politicians can wrap their heads around it being protected. So we manipulate the lines. Darwin said very clearly in The Origin of Species that species are arbitrary terms for convenience. The main word in the title of his most famous book, he admitted could not be defined. In a letter to his friend Joseph Hooker, he said he finds it laughable that biologists debate about what's a species or a subspecies or a variety. He said it all comes from trying to define the undefinable.
I really dislike the biological species concept. So let's dive in. This is where I'm going to try to convince you that species don't actually exist. We're now going to break this down a little bit and talk about whether or not we actually think species exist. I definitely think that the way we use the species concept to describe diversity is reckless and is vulnerable to sort of exceptions. So there are two main arguments that I'm going to make in this section. The first one is based on definitions. Like I said, I really don't like the biological species concept because it is really centered around large, charismatic vertebrate taxa, vertebrate organisms. The biological species concept defines species based on their ability or inability to create viable offspring through sexual reproduction. The vast majority of life does not reproduce sexually. The issue this poses is that this completely breaks down the biological species concept because we need a good way to define diversity in these groups that don't require sexual reproduction. And so to put this into perspective a little bit, this is a relatively new representation of the tree of life, all living things. And so when we're looking at how do we define species, what's the definition we're going to use for species, the definition that we use right now applies to this single branch of the tree of life. And now we're supposed to be using this definition, the biological species concept, to describe diversity across the rest of the tree. That's a major issue I have with this. The other issue I have is that the biological species concept doesn't even apply to all vertebrates, which is the group it was designed to work for. So there are lots of examples where we call things different species, even though they can reproduce and produce viable offspring with each other. There are also really interesting examples, though, where we call things different species, even though these vertebrates don't require sexual reproduction, right? So this is a process called parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis is a process by which female organisms can produce offspring without being fertilized by a male. For example, this is a whiptail lizard from New Mexico. Every representative, every individual of the species is female. There are no male New Mexico whiptail lizards because females produce offspring without being fertilized. We've seen the same thing in Komodo dragons, right? This mysterious phenomenon where there were a couple Komodo dragons in zoos a couple of years ago, where all of a sudden they were producing eggs that hatched when they had never been in contact with a male. It was surprising that zookeepers all of a sudden have multiple Komodo dragons in an exhibit where there's only supposed to be one or two. Fish, sharks, this phenomenon of parthenogenesis is actually becoming increasingly common, right? The harder we look for parthenogenic organisms, the more we find. Again, the biological species concept falls apart when you have species like this. And so when we look at the diversity of organisms that aren't described by the biological species concept, from bacteria to plants, microbes, and all the way up to vertebrates, I think we have to ask ourselves, how can we use species as our primary unit for describing diversity if we can't reliably define what a species is? Now, the other issue that I have with using species and the Linnaean taxonomy to describe diversity is that I think it misses the point. It's focusing on the wrong things. And so for this section, we're going to talk about how evolutionary change is continuous. Evolution itself is a continuous process. It is always creating diversity. And what we end up with is a continuous spectrum of diversity. The Linnaean taxonomy is not designed to reflect this. Once you have variation within a species, there's really no good way to account for this in the Linnaean taxonomy without starting to designate increasingly specific sublevels, so subspecies. But you will always end up with this issue until you are assigning individuals identification. The Linnaean taxonomy will always obscure some level of diversity. So this is the other main issue that I have with the Linnaean taxonomy, that evolution is a continuous process, and that continuous spectrum of diversity that it's creating is really important to account for. However, the Linnaean taxonomy likes to put things in boxes, and those boxes will always obscure some level of diversity, and it risks obscuring the processes themselves that generate diversity. So if we go back to the goal of systematics, the goal of classification, the whole reason we're describing species in the first place is that we want to understand the diversity in the world around us. I would counter that understanding that diversity is fine and interesting, but what we really need to be doing is working on a system that understands not only the diversity, but the processes that generate the diversity that we see.
Nature to me is an interconnected, constantly changing continuum.
Evolution is a continuous process, and that continuous spectrum of diversity that it's creating is really important to account for.
Thank you both. This video was inspired by Steve Martin's play Picasso at the Lapin Agile. In this comedy, Steve Martin imagines a meeting of Einstein and Picasso at a Parisian nightclub where they discuss their different views of the world.